The mud on the roadside had frozen into brittle ridges overnight, and every step the young women took sent a quiet crack through the cold morning air. They marched in a thin column, their uniforms mismatched and worn, remnants of whatever the collapsing Reich had issued in its final, desperate months. Breath drifted in front of them in pale clouds, but their eyes, wide, sleepless, darting from guard to guard, held a deeper frost. Most of them had not fired a weapon or stood on a front line. They were clerks, signal operators, nurses, volunteers from towns that now existed only as ruins on a newsreel. Yet the moment the Americans ordered them forward, fear settled on their shoulders heavier than the packs they carried. They walked as if approaching a sentence they had already accepted. One of them, a 20-year-old from Hamburg named Lotte, pressed her fingers against her coat sleeve to quiet their trembling. Another, Marta, kept whispering prayers beneath her breath, not out of piety but panic. Every woman in the line feared the same thing, a terror planted not by experience but by the voices that had surrounded them for years. The propaganda had been relentless. Radios crackled with warnings that American troops spared no mercy for German women. Pamphlets insisted that capture meant humiliation, contamination, or worse. The word disease had been repeated so often it had become a shadow trailing every thought. Syphilis, spoken like a curse, a punishment, a weapon. Many were told that the Americans used it carelessly or deliberately, that camps would be places where no boundary held, where they would be touched, forced, or exploited the moment the gates closed behind them. These stories had spread through barracks faster than the rumors of Allied advances. Even now, as the women trudged through the frost-bitten fields of eastern France, those warnings replayed in their minds with cruel clarity. The tension between expectation and reality, between fear and the unknown, made every footstep feel like an approach toward something dark and inescapable. The American soldiers escorting them, however, seemed preoccupied with entirely different matters. Most stared straight ahead, rifles slung lazily, glancing back only to count heads or adjust the spacing of the march. Their faces showed neither cruelty nor interest, just exhaustion. Weeks of pursuit, paperwork, relocations, and endless streams of prisoners had turned them into figures of routine. To the women, this indifference felt unreal. They had expected predatory eyes, the kind described in the fear-soaked leaflets distributed by German officers in retreat. Instead, the Americans barely seemed to notice them. One sergeant, a broad-shouldered man from Ohio, walked with the slouched posture of someone who missed home more than he cared about the war's last spoils. Another soldier hummed a tune under his breath, something the women could not place but recognized as painfully out of place in the tense march. The contrast between expectation and reality made some of them even more fearful, as if this calm were merely a disguise for something looming. Lotte kept replaying the last conversation she'd had with her unit commander before the surrender. The woman, stern-faced and unwavering, had warned them that Americans would take what they wanted, and that the only protection the auxiliaries had was vigilance. "Do not trust a single gesture," she had said. "They will try to fool you. They will pretend to be civilized." Those words had stuck like burrs. Now, with each passing minute, the landscape around them thinned into open fields, and on the horizon, they saw the faint outline of their destination, a POW collection point surrounded by fences and watchtowers. The sight of it made Marta stumble. Her knees buckled, but before she fell, Lotte caught her elbow. For a moment, the column slowed. One of the guards approached, his footsteps crunching over ice, but instead of grabbing Marta or shouting, he simply asked if she was injured. The calmness of his tone startled her so badly she nodded before she could think. He stepped back, gave a brief gesture for her to keep pace, and returned to his position without another word. The women exchanged glances, startled, and even more confused. As they drew closer to the camp, new sounds reached them. Clanging pots, distant orders, the rhythmic shuffle of men unloading supply trucks. The place looked nothing like the nightmare corridors described in German propaganda. It resembled a temporary city built from wood, barbed wire, and discipline. Smoke rose from a kitchen hut, drifting into the cold air like a promise of warmth rather than a threat. For some of the women, this unexpected normalcy was more unnerving than the horrors they had imagined. It suggested structure, rules, and a system they did not understand. They had been taught to expect chaos, to be thrown into a pit of danger, yet everything here appeared strangely organized. Even the guards at the entrance checked their paperwork with weary professionalism. Their expressions remained unreadable, but not hostile. Still, fear clung stubbornly to the women. Their boots hesitated as they approached the gate, shadows stretching long across the ground. They remembered the rumors of women being singled out at camp gates, of being examined in ways meant to humiliate. They braced for hands grabbing their arms, for leering faces or harsh commands. A few whispered to each other to stay together, to move as one, as if closeness could protect them. But when the gates opened, the guards simply stepped aside, gesturing them in with a curt nod. A medical corpsman pointed them toward a registration tent without coming closer than necessary. His gloves were clean, his mask slightly askew, and he held a clipboard as though it were a shield. The women passed him slowly, waiting for the moment something would happen, something that justified their terror. Nothing came. Inside the camp, their senses adjusted to an unexpected rhythm. The barracks they were directed to were simple but intact, wooden walls, narrow beds, coarse blankets. No one had prepared them for the possibility that captivity could feel like an anticlimax. They sat on the edges of their bunks, exchanging glances that carried equal parts relief and suspicion. Marta's hand still shook, but she could breathe again. Latte's gaze wandered across the room, noting how the guards monitored from outside rather than stepping in. A U.S. lieutenant read the intake log with the emotional investment of someone reviewing grocery lists. This mundanity defied every warning they had ever been given. It did not erase the fear, but it cracked it. As night approached, the temperature dropped sharply. A soft wind worked its way through the cracks in the walls, carrying faint sounds from other parts of the camp. The women huddled beneath their blankets, their bodies relaxing for the first time in days, though their minds remained restlessly awake. Latte watched the doorway, expecting at any moment that the calm would break. She replayed the scene at the gate again. The guard stepping back instead of forward, the medic avoiding even the brush of a sleeve. It unsettled her. Not because it was threatening, but because it wasn't. Everything she had believed was colliding with everything she was seeing. The contradictions were building toward something she could not yet name. Then, just as the camp settled into darkness, a lantern outside flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the barracks wall. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. The women tensed. A silhouette paused at the doorway, and for a heartbeat, every rumor they had been told sharpened into near certainty. But the figure did not enter. Instead, the guard cleared his throat and delivered a message through the open frame, his tone flat and almost bored. "Lights out. No one leaves the barracks," he said. Then, as if remembering something, he added, "Medical checks in the morning. Female staff only." With that, he walked away, the lantern's glow drifting with him until it disappeared. The women were left staring into the dimness, stunned by a truth more disorienting than fear. The Americans didn't even want to come near them. And for the first time, a new question rose quietly among them, one that none dared speak aloud yet. What if everything we believed was wrong? Morning arrived with a pale, wash-out light that slid through the cracks of the barracks wall and fell across the women's faces. Latte woke first, startled by the quiet. In the stories they had been told, American camps were loud, chaotic, filled with shouting men and crude inspections. Instead, the silence felt almost ceremonial. Footsteps approached only intermittently, each one accompanied by the distant jangle of keys or the rustle of paperwork. Marta stirred beside her, blinking as if she expected the room to shift into something dangerous the moment she stood. But nothing happened. No guard barged through the doorway. No orders were barked. There was only the steady hum of activity outside, muffled and strangely ordinary. When the door finally opened, a medic stepped in, not the gruff male figure they had braced for, but a woman in a crisp uniform with a scarf tucked neatly beneath her collar. She carried a clipboard and wore an expression that balanced fatigue with practiced patience. Without lifting her voice, she instructed the women to line up for examination. Latte and Marta exchanged a stunned glance. The medic maintained a respectful distance, her posture formal, almost rigid. She didn't touch anyone unless absolutely necessary, and when she did, checking a pulse, examining frostbitten fingers, she used gloves and moved with clinical precision. The sight sent a ripple through the room, a collective exhale of confusion and relief. Outside, the camp revealed itself layer by layer. Rows of wooden structures, supply trucks moving slowly along gravel paths, guards stationed at clear intervals. Everything operated with mechanical consistency, as if someone had drawn the camp on paper and the soldiers were simply acting out lines. The women were directed toward a registration tent, where an American corporal flipped through forms with the detached focus of a man who had processed far too many names. He didn't look at them directly, as though eye contact might break a regulation. Even his tone was monotone when he asked for ages, hometowns, and unit numbers. The distance was unmistakable, not hostile but intentional, as if every step of the procedure had been designed to prevent complications. Latte noticed it first. The guards avoided standing too near the women. Even when guiding them, they gestured rather than approached. One soldier moved aside so abruptly when Marta stepped closer to read a posted schedule that it startled both of them. Instead of apologizing, he simply cleared his throat and retreated another step, his gaze dropping to his boot. The awkwardness of it left Marta speechless. In the barracks the night before, she had feared hands grabbing her without warning. Now, she worried that the Americans might flee if she raised her voice. As the women were escorted to a fenced yard for orientation, the contrast between their expectations and the reality of the camp sharpened even further. A lieutenant stood at the front, reading from a booklet outlining camp rules. His voice was steady, rehearsed. No woman would be searched by a male guard. No woman would be housed with men. Any complaint regarding conduct would be investigated immediately. Violations would be punished. The clarity of each line rang like a hammer against everything Latte had been taught. She felt as though she were shedding layers of fear one sentence at a time, yet she couldn't fully trust the relief spreading through her chest. Fear, after all, was stubborn. It clung even when it had no ground left beneath it. While standing in line for their midday meal, Marta whispered, "They won't even look at us." Latte nodded, watching a guard turn his head sharply away when one of the women asked for a utensil. He placed it on the table instead of handing it over, stepping back as though physical proximity itself carried risk. The rumors about disease echoed faintly in Latte's memory. She had been told that Americans didn't care about sickness, that they would use women's bodies without concern for consequences. But here, the distance felt like a wall built from fear of contamination, or perhaps fear of accusations. Whatever the reason, the effect was unmistakable. The Americans kept a buffer between themselves and the women so carefully it felt choreographed. In the afternoon, during a break from orientation, Latte wandered near the perimeter fence where a medic was disinfecting equipment. The sharp scent of alcohol hung in the air. When he noticed her watching, he froze, then offered a quick nod before returning to his task. His movements were efficient, almost obsessive, as though hygiene itself had become a shield. Latte remembered hearing about disease outbreaks across Europe, civilians wandering through ruined cities, hospitals overrun, infections spreading through displaced populations. Perhaps the Americans were guarding themselves. The thought unsettled her more than the propaganda ever had. If both sides were afraid, then fear had no single direction. It was everywhere. Marta joined her, arms wrapped tightly around her ribs. "Why do they act like we might bite them?" she whispered. Latte didn't answer at first. She watched a guard lift a water bucket using only the very edge of its handle, then set it down as if expecting it to explode. She finally murmured, "Maybe they were warned about us too." Marta stared at her, the idea sinking slowly. It was a notion that shifted something fundamental inside them, a quiet pivot from being potential victims to being possible threats, at least in the Americans' minds. As the day stretched toward evening, the camp rhythms settled into predictable patterns. Orders, meals, inspections, roll calls, punctuated by the steady avoidance practiced by every American in sight. Latte began to study the faces of the guards, looking for cracks in their composure. Some appeared embarrassed by the formality. Others looked determined to follow every rule exactly. But none showed the hunger or cruelty she had been warned about. The absence of it was so total it left her disoriented, as if she were walking through a dream with mismatched pieces. When they were finally dismissed back to their barracks, exhaustion washed over the women. They moved with slower steps now, not from fear but from the heavy realization that their understanding of the world was shifting. Inside, the lantern flickered again, its glow soft against the wooden walls. Latte sat on her bunk, letting the silence gather around her. She felt something unfamiliar creeping into her thoughts. Not trust, not yet, but the beginnings of doubt in everything she had believed. As she lay down, Marta whispered, "If they don't want anything from us, what does that mean?" Latte stared into the dim light, sensing an answer forming, a possibility both unsettling and strangely hopeful. Before she could speak, a distant shout cut through the camp, sharp enough to make every woman sit upright. Footsteps thundered past their barracks, urgent and unguarded. And in that sudden burst of movement, Latte felt the fragile calm tremble, as though the truth behind the Americans' distance was about to surface at last. The shout that rattled the quiet camp faded quickly, replaced by the steady rhythm of daily routines returning to their track. By morning, the women realized it had been nothing more than an argument between guards about missing supplies, yet the jolt it delivered lingered. It reminded them that captivity, however orderly, was still captivity. Latte stepped outside into the crisp air, noticing how the camp seemed to breathe with a slow, deliberate pulse. Soldiers moved along predictable paths, their boots thudding softly on the worn ground. None looked directly at the women, as if eye contact itself were a breach of regulation. This persistent distance had become more than a gesture. It felt like a barrier built with invisible bricks. Marta watched them too, arms folded, whispering that the Americans seemed more frightened of the women than the women were of them. The idea unsettled them both, yet neither could dismiss it. As the day unfolded, the women were given tasks meant to occupy their time and maintain order. They scrubbed laundry in large metal basins, the water cold enough to sting their skin. They folded blankets, swept walkways, and carried crates filled with supplies. None of these tasks were harsh, yet each revealed the Americans' determination to limit contact. One guard placed a stack of tools on the ground rather than handing them over, then retreated several steps as if expecting contamination. Marta let out a breathless laugh, a sound so rare in the camp that several women glanced at her. She quickly stifled it, embarrassed, but Latte felt a flicker of warmth at hearing something so human break through the tension. Humor, however brief, softened the edges of their fear. In the mess tent, the Americans served food with practiced efficiency. They spooned portions onto tin trays without speaking, sometimes without even lifting their eyes. The women noticed how the servers wore gloves, sleeves rolled neatly, uniforms crisp despite the cold. Latte studied the face of a young private whose hand shook slightly each time he approached the serving line. He always minimized the movement, as though the slightest brush of fingers across a tray might spark catastrophe. The precision became almost comical. Marta whispered that if the Americans could have used tongs long enough to reach across the tent, they would have. The women ate quietly, exchanging small glances that carried a mix of relief and bewilderment. None of them had expected a captivity defined by distance rather than dominance. Later, during a break, Latte wandered toward the fence where a group of prisoners sat repairing uniforms. A guard monitored them from several meters away, posture rigid, jaw clenched. He looked young, barely older than Latte, yet he carried himself with the stiff caution of someone terrified of misstep. When one of the women rose to adjust the fabric pile, he took a half-step backward, his boot scraping nervously across the dirt. Latte watched the motion closely, feeling a strange shift inside her. The stories they had been told, the warnings, the threats, the grotesque predictions, cracked under the weight of such timid behavior. It was difficult to fear a man who seemed ready to flee if she sneezed in his direction. Still, nights remained hardest. The barracks grew cold quickly, and the silence left too much space for old fears to echo. The women whispered about home, about the front lines collapsing, about rumors they'd heard before surrender. Slowly, the conversations turned toward the Americans. Some admitted they had expected violence. Others confessed to imagining far worse. Latte found herself listening more than speaking, absorbing every account like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form the picture she had been taught to expect. She noticed how the guards never lingered near their windows. She noticed how even the officers kept a deliberate, respectful distance when giving instructions. The more she observed, the more she sensed a pattern, something unspoken guiding every interaction. One afternoon, rain swept across the camp, turning the paths into slick ribbons of mud. The women huddled under a shelter while American engineers hammered plywood over a leaky roof across the yard. Their movements were hurried, purposeful, and carefully angled away from the women. When one of the engineers slipped and nearly fell, Marta instinctively stepped forward to help, but he raised a hand sharply, refusing her approach. his face flushed with embarrassment rather than anger, and he muttered something she couldn't hear before returning to his work. Marta returned to the group, cheeks burning, whispering that he looked more frightened of her than she was of him. Lotte felt the truth of it settle deeper. The fear between both sides mirrored one another, but its causes remained hidden. As days passed, small moments revealed glimpses of humanity beneath the regulations. A medic quietly left extra bandages near their barracks, pretending not to notice when the women collected them. A cook placed an extra ladle of stew on the trays of the youngest prisoners, glancing away quickly as if kindness violated protocol. These gestures were subtle, almost accidental, yet they wove a fragile thread of trust. Lotte began to realize that the Americans weren't simply indifferent. They were holding themselves back, restrained by something she had yet to fully understand. One evening, as the sun dipped low and drenched the camp in muted gold, Marta leaned against the doorframe of their barracks and murmured, "What if none of them wanted us here at all? Not like that, just not at all." Lotte turned the idea over in her mind. The Americans' distance no longer felt like disdain. It felt like caution. Purposeful, heavy caution. They weren't avoiding the women out of cruelty. They were avoiding them out of fear. Fear of consequences, fear of disease, fear of accusations, perhaps fear of their own inexperience. The layers of silence around the truth made it almost impossible to name, yet Lotte felt herself drawing closer to it with each passing day. That night, as a storm rolled in and thunder rumbled faintly beyond the hills, the women settled into uneasy sleep. The lantern swayed with each gust of wind, casting restless patterns across the wooden walls. Lotte lay awake, listening to the distant hum of generators and the soft murmur of guards changing shift. Then, somewhere near the main yard, a voice rose, firm, authoritative, calling for an officer. Footsteps converged, urgent and unrestrained, breaking the camp's usual rhythm. Marta sat upright instantly, her eyes wide. Lotte felt her heart quicken, not from fear of what might be done to them, but from fear of what truth was finally about to surface. The commotion near the main yard grew louder, a brief storm of boots and clipped orders that shattered the camp's usual restraint. Lotte and Marta pressed near the barracks window, straining to see what had disturbed the practiced calm. Lanterns swung through the dusk as several guards converged around a medic's tent. Their voices carried fragments of urgency, sharpened by tension, yet nothing in their tone hinted at danger directed toward the prisoners. The fear that once lived inside the women, fear of what might be done to them, felt strangely distant now, replaced by curiosity about the truth behind the secrecy threading through the camp. As the guards dispersed and the noise ebbed, a lingering question settled heavily on the women. What were the Americans protecting so fiercely? The answer began to unfold the next morning, though not through any dramatic revelation. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost accidentally. The women were lined up for their routine inspection, waiting under a sliver of early light. A medic approached with a tray of ointments, his sleeves rolled neatly, hands gloved. Lotte noticed he looked younger than she had realized before, barely past 20. When Marta stepped forward for treatment of a small cut, the medic hesitated, not out of disgust but intention. His voice trembled slightly as he muttered, "Stay still," maintaining distance even while tending to her injury. Lotte watched his deliberate caution, the way he kept his face angled away, as though proximity itself might put him at risk. Later, while gathering firewood from the supply shed, she overheard two American soldiers speaking in low voices. One complained about the constant warnings given during briefings. Never touch the prisoners, never stand too close, never allow misunderstandings. Their own stories, their own fears. Warnings that German civilians carried diseases, that accusations could ruin careers, that maintaining perfect distance was the only safe path. The women had feared the men. The men had feared the women. And neither side had truly seen the other. As the day faded, Lotte felt a shift inside her, like a knot loosening after being pulled too tight for too long. She realized the Americans weren't cold or cruel. They were trapped behind rules every bit as confining as the fences enclosing the camp. Marta sensed the change too, watching Lotte with eyes that mixed relief and uncertainty. "So we were all afraid," Marta murmured. "Just for different reasons." Lotte nodded, startled by how obvious it now seemed. That night, wind rattled the barracks walls, and the women gathered near the lantern's glow. The air felt different, lighter, as if a heavy veil had finally lifted. They spoke quietly, reflecting on the weeks since their capture. One woman confessed she had feared assault the moment she saw American uniforms. Another admitted she had cried herself to sleep the first night, convinced she would be harmed. Yet now, each recalled moments that contradicted those terrors. A guard stepping aside politely, a medic offering reassurance, a cook slipping extra potatoes onto a tray. As they talked, the truth settled like a final piece clicking into place. The Americans had not even tried to touch them. Not out of disinterest, nor disdain, but because they were committed, almost painfully, to keeping boundaries intact. Everything the women had feared had been a ghost born from propaganda. Just before lights out, footsteps approached their barracks once more. The silhouette in the doorway belonged to the same young medic from earlier. He spoke with unusual softness. A new standings. The other muttered that even an innocent gesture might lead to accusations or disciplinary action. Their caution wasn't a personal judgment against the women. It was a command drilled into them with relentless insistence. Latte absorbed the words with a slow, dawning clarity. The wall between guards and prisoners wasn't shaped by hostility. It had been built from fear of consequences. That realization settled heavily inside her. The propaganda she had been fed had depicted Americans as reckless, immoral, predatory. Yet these men seemed terrified of failing their own regulations. She began to watch them differently, observing their discomfort rather than their authority. A guard clearing his throat before giving instructions. A cook avoiding eye contact while passing out bread. A lieutenant stiffening whenever a woman stepped too close. It was as though they believed one wrong movement could unravel everything they were responsible for upholding. That afternoon, a female nurse arrived to conduct a more thorough medical screening. She moved briskly, keeping the women organized with efficient gestures. As she checked Latte's temperature, she spoke softly, almost kindly, explaining that the screenings protected both sides from potential outbreaks. Latte hesitated before asking the question that had burned through her thoughts since the march. Why do the soldiers act as if we're dangerous? The nurse paused, meeting her eyes with a look that held neither pity nor judgment. They're following orders, she replied. We're told to avoid contact. Too many risks. Too many rumors back home. Latte blinked, absorbing the unexpected symmetry. The Americans had their protocol was being implemented, he explained. Additional screenings. More distance. More caution. His voice faltered as he added, It's not you. It's policy. Then he stepped back into the darkness. The door shut and silence settled. Latte stared at the fading lantern light, her heart steady for the first time since capture. Yet beneath that calm grew a deeper question, one that pressed into her thoughts with quiet force. If the Americans were never the threat, if the danger had always been imagined, then who had shaped that fear in the first place, and why? The answer, she sensed, was far more complicated than anything the camp's fences could contain. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.